We think of sex as this taboo topic that nobody talks about. But there's something fascinating hiding in human history. Our ancestors had to learn about sex somehow. They didn't have schools. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have parents sitting them down for the talk. So how did ancient humans discover one of the most powerful drives in human nature? Today on Dark Human, we're exploring the psychology and history of how our ancestors learned about sex. And trust me, it's messier, more primal, and way more interesting than you think. Observation and imitation. The first teachers, nature itself. Ancient humans didn't learn about sex from textbooks. They learned from the world around them. Living in close quarters, caves, huts, small communities, there was no privacy. Children grew up seeing adults have sex. Not in a hidden, shameful way. It was just part of life, as natural as eating or sleeping. Anthropologists call this learning by observation. A child watches their parents or other adults, and sexuality becomes normalized. The body becomes a natural part of existence, not something mysterious or forbidden. But here's the psychological twist. Imitation goes deeper than just watching. During puberty, when hormones flood the adolescent brain, something primal happens. The body changes. Sexual urges emerge. And suddenly, that thing they observed as a child, sex makes sense. It's not intellectual understanding. It's biological recognition. The ancient brain didn't need instructions. It needed biology to activate, and the memory of what they'd observed would resurface. This is why some psychologists argue that early sexual education through observation might have actually prepared young people for puberty rather than shocking them. But observation alone wasn't enough. Peer teaching and experimentation. The real university, other teenagers. Here's something we don't talk about enough: adolescents teaching other adolescents. In ancient societies, teenagers had freedom we can barely imagine today. They lived in communities where they had peers, autonomy, and nobody documenting their every move. That's a recipe for natural sexual exploration. Archaeological evidence suggests that teenage sexuality was largely unmonitored. Young people figured things out together through trial, error, and experimentation. There's evidence from ancient cultures, from indigenous societies to early civilizations, of adolescent sexual activity being normalized or even facilitated as a rite of passage. Think about it, psychologically humans are pack animals. Teenagers in a tribe would have explored sexuality with peers, sometimes playfully, sometimes seriously. They'd communicate what felt good, what didn't work, what was possible. This is fundamentally different from modern sex education, where we separate teenagers and tell them, "Don't do this." Ancient teenagers weren't getting warnings. They were getting practical experience. But here's where it gets darker. In some ancient societies, older adults actively taught younger people about sex. This took forms we'd now call abuse, but in their cultural context, it was sometimes seen as education or ritual. An older warrior initiating a younger one. An elder teaching through action, not words. This raises uncomfortable questions. Was this abuse? Or was it the ancient version of sex education, just with power dynamics we'd now find repulsive? The answer is probably both. It fulfilled an educational function while also being exploitative, which tells us something about human nature. We're capable of learning and being harmed simultaneously. Cultural rituals and ceremony. Formalized learning, rites of passage. As societies became more complex, they formalized sexual knowledge through ritual. Many ancient cultures had explicit rites of passage where young people were taught about sexuality. The Sambians of Papua New Guinea, for example, had ritualized sexual practices as part of male initiation. Aboriginal Australians passed down sexual knowledge through ceremony and story. These weren't crude or shameful. They were purposeful. Elders would teach young people about how to please a partner, fertility and reproduction, the psychological and emotional aspects of sex, gender roles and sexual expectations. Storytelling was the internet of ancient times. Myths, legends, and folk tales weren't just entertainment. They were sexual education disguised as stories. Myths about gods having affairs taught power dynamics. Stories of seduction taught persuasion. Legends of fertility taught reproduction. In many cultures, there were also sex manuals. Ancient India had the Kama Sutra. Ancient Rome had erotic poetry and visual guides. Ancient China had sex manuals that were treated as seriously as medical texts. The point? Ancient societies knew that sexual knowledge needed to be passed down, and they created systems to do it. Not always healthily by modern standards, but systematically nonetheless. The role of shame and secrecy. When everything changed. Here's where the psychology gets interesting. Shame about sex is actually relatively recent. Religious institutions, particularly Christianity, Islam, and certain forms of Judaism, introduced the idea that sex was shameful, sinful, or dirty. For thousands of years before that, in many cultures, sexuality was viewed neutrally or even celebrated. This shift created a psychological problem. How do you teach people about something you've told them is shameful? Suddenly, the open observation model broke down. Parents couldn't teach their children directly. Peers had to figure things out in secret. And adults? They couldn't discuss it openly. This is when sex education became hidden, shameful whispers between friends, stolen glances at forbidden materials, experimentation done in shadows. Psychologically, this shame fundamentally changed how humans relate to sexuality. It moved from biological knowledge to forbidden knowledge, from practical to secretive, from communal to isolated. And that isolation created psychological damage we're still recovering from. What this tells us. Ancient humans didn't need doctors to teach them about sex. They didn't need shame. They needed exposure, peer learning, and cultural frameworks for understanding sexuality. We've built so much shame and secrecy around sex that we've forgotten what our ancestors knew. Sexuality is biological, normal, and learnable. The dark part? How we've weaponized ignorance and shame against entire generations.